Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today. Right over here, we have Mustafa Akyol, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has also been an opinion writer at the New York Times. He is the author of several books, including Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, which was published earlier this year. He's also written The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims, which was published in 2017, and Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty in 2011. His books have been translated into many languages and have been praised in the New York Times, the LA Times, The Economist, Financial Times, Wall Street Journals, and many other publications throughout the world, and especially in Muslim countries as well. However, his book, Islam Without Extremes, was banned in Malaysia for criticizing the religion police there. The Thinking Muslim, which is a popular podcast, recently defined Akyol as probably the most notable Muslim modernist and reformer, something that I wholeheartedly agree with. And in July 2021, the Prospect magazine of the UK listed him as the world's top 50 thinkers. Today, we will speak to him and Dr. Wali Nasser about his recent book, which is Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty. It was published by libertarianism.org, which is a project of the Cato Institute. I would also like to introduce you to Dr. Wali Nasser, who is one of the most prominent commenters of Islam within America and in the state of the Muslim world as well. Dr. Nasser is the Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS, and he's also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Center for South Asia. He has served as the Dean of SAIS between 2012 and 2019, and he also served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's also the author of many, many books, and this one is my personal favorite, The Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future. He has also written Democracy in Iran, History and the Quest for Liberty, Islamic Leviathan, Islam and the Making of State Power, and finally Maududi and the Making of Islamic Revivalism. He has advised senior American policymakers, world leaders, businesses, including the President, Secretary of State, senior members of Congress, and presidential campaigns. He has written for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, along with many other publications. And he was kind enough to give Mustafa's latest book, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty, calling it a must-read for Muslims and non-Muslims alike. So thank you both for being here today. And so Mustafa, I'd like to start with you first. So earlier this year, you wrote Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. And now, 6 months later, we have this excellent book, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty. So can you just tell us a little bit about what is the difference between both of the books?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Sahar, for this very kind, generous introduction and for moderating our event. And thanks to Dr. Nasser for being with us today. I'm honored by his endorsement and his support for my work. Indeed, 6 months ago, I published Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason and Freedom and Tolerance. That was a more theological, philosophical approach to some of the bigger issues in Islam. So the people who read that book will learn a lot about Ibn Rushd and Ibn Tufayl and Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites, but how those classical different perspectives in Islam can help Muslim perspectives today. This book is a more diluted, condensed and accessible discussion of one single issue, liberty, freedom, or hurriya, as we call it in Muslim languages. And here I cover other topics too. For example, I especially go back between Islam and classical liberal tradition. I go back, between Islamic thought and John Locke very often. Like, do we have a notion of political contract in Islam, or should governments be based on this idea of a contract between the rulers and the ruled? Or should you obey the ruler? That's a teaching that we find in some texts. There's a discussion of free markets here, which you don't have in the other book. And there are discussions about late 19th century Ottoman and Arab liberals and how classical liberals who admired constitutional government, freedom of speech, free markets in the West, and tried to reconcile that with Islam. So if people ask me which book should I read, well, read both because they cover different angles, but it's all one big argument, I think, about rereading Islam with respect to the sources of Islam, the foundation of Islam, and the tradition itself as well, but also in a modern and new light, because we live in a dramatically different world. And I believe in finding roots within Islam for cultivating them today. In the 19th century, when, for example, Muslim intellectuals like Namık Kemal, late Ottoman Empire, they saw something called democracy, and well, you don't have something exactly named democracy in Islamic tradition, but they said, oh, and the Quran is calling us for shura, which is consultation, so that can be the basis of arguing for democracy. And I think the same thing is true for freedom of speech or freedom of religion. But you need to do a lot of criticism and rethinking as well. So this book condenses all those arguments in one accessible volume and explains why, as a Muslim, I defend liberty. So it's an Islamic argument for liberalism in the broader sense of the term.
Very good, very good.
Thank you.
And so, Dr. Nasser, you had mentioned that you had read both of your books. So I was wondering if you could discuss basically what you thought and Mustafa's comments as well about both of the books.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be on this panel, and thank you for your very generous introduction at the beginning. I think I agree with Mustafa. Both books are valuable, and those who are interested in the topic should read it. You know, I came to both of these books from the angle that there is now a sort of a given view of Islam, both in the minds of many Muslims, but also in the minds of many Westerners. Namely, this is a particular faith. It says this particular thing. It's kind of been a closed box since the revelation long time ago. And all you need to know is like, what is the short, 14 chapters of the Quran say? I mean, I don't know how many congressmen, media people who say, well, the Quran says this, the Quran says that. I think Mustafa's first book in particular brings to the fore that there's a very rich history of debate within Islam itself about faith and reason, and where does one stop and the other one starts, and that there are periods in which the Muslims have intensely debated these issues, and the times that they did these debates, they were not answering to Western criticism. It was actually completely internal to the Muslim world. And both Muslims and Westerners ought to know what were the arguments, why did the arguments succeed and didn't. And I think Mustafa brings to light in his first book very clearly the notion that there is a strong argument for rationality, rational argumentation, whether it's in law, it's in theology, and that can lead you to a very different place where than the definitions that we see. So I think it's an important book in that regard, and it's also a very accessible book. So people don't need to know Arabic languages or other Islamic languages to access this. He actually brings out a lot of these arguments in a very cogent and clear way. This latest book I found very interesting because I think he starts with a very interesting question, which is, are you free to believe or not believe? Does God give that right to Muslims, and are they individually accountable for that choice? Because I think the question of liberty starts from there. That and this notion that also is in the Quran, that there's no compulsion in religion. So that can mean that, first of all, there's no compulsion in you being a Muslim, and you're responsible directly, personally to God. It's not up to the rest of society to sort of ensure that you make the right choice. And he has a very nice quotation there from an Iranian diplomat who says, yes, people can make a choice, but they will be punished for the wrong choice. Right? But so I think that's a very important notion. And I think it's a very important notion for all religions. You have a right not to believe, and then is there individual responsibility for your choice, which is between you and God. And secondly, the argument that even if you choose to be a Muslim, is there only one way to think about Islam? And that relates this book really to his last book, that there are different ways in which Muslims have accessed the notion of spirituality and religion. And then finally is that is there a way to think about free market, social liberties, political liberties, freedom of speech within an Islamic context? And maybe there is not a simple answer to say that it's written in black letter in Islamic texts that you have freedom of speech, but I think the book makes a very clear case that there's a lot more room to think and argue and interpret than often is assumed. Mm-hmm. That Islam is not just sort of things written in black letter law that thou shalt and thou shalt not. There's a lot of room to interpret things. So I think in those senses, it really opens our minds in terms of how we should react to the faith of 1.7 billion people, and how they should also think about their own faith going forward.
Those are excellent points, and the compulsion element also strikes me as well. I'm Muslim and I grew up in Pakistan, and so that's something that I think I've seen a lot just growing up in Pakistani society. You know, this tug of war between enforcement and sort of your own individual freedom of how you want to practice. And so I wanted to ask both of you, basically, you know, usually in Muslim countries, there's a lot of struggle and opinions about how women dress, right? And you actually start off your book with a really interesting story of how you were traveling from Saudi Arabia and how the women were dressed a certain way, and then when they were going to Istanbul, or as the plane was nearing Istanbul, some of them changed their attire. Yep. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, and what does that really mean, and also what does that sort of shift midair mean, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I use that story, as you said, to entertain one important idea in the book, which is, as you well point out, I mean, the discussion about religious coercion and the futility of coercion. Actually, John Locke makes this argument. I mean, again, when I read Locke 20 years ago, I said, oh my God, he gets it, and these are our issues today. Like, if you coerce people to believe or practice a faith, all you get is not real piety, but hypocrisy, and sometimes resentment of the faith. And I mean, and that story, like, that was a flight I had from Riyadh to Istanbul, my hometown back then, you know, 2013. You know, I got on the plane, and this is a thing most people know. I mean, every woman gets on the plane fully covered. That's the law. That's by law. You have to dress in a certain way in Saudi Arabia for women. And then while we're getting close to Istanbul, not all, but some of them, you know, went back to the lavatory. They changed. They put makeup, and they were looking very differently. And I said to myself, well, if the Saudis are hoping to make everybody pious in the way they understand, of course, does piety entail a certain dress code? That's a different discussion, or what it exactly is a different discussion. They're not even achieving that, because you know, those people are actually looking forward to go to a society where you don't have that. So they're not even creating a sincere religiosity. And this is just the beginning of a longer discussion, right? I mean, the verse that Dr. Nasser, you know, mentioned, La ikraha fid din, you know, there is no compulsion in religion. That has become the motto of all liberal-minded Muslims in the past several decades, I think. And I think it's a very powerful statement. There is no compulsion in religion. It means freedom, because freedom is defined generally as, at least some philosophers have defined it as, lack of coercion, right? And if you have a Quranic verse which says there is no coercion in religion, that's very powerful. However, as I show in the book, some scholars immediately take an issue with that. Right. And I quoted a Turkish scholar from the more conservative imam, you know, I don't need to mention his name, but people can read. He says, actually there is compulsion in religion. There is no compulsion to the religion, but there is in the religion. What he makes is that, well, we will not force people to enter Islam if they're not Muslims in the first place, which is generally accepted. And I think that's one of the positive sides of the great Islamic story, that, I mean, Jews and Christians and Hindus were not forcibly converted to Islam, because the Quran said that, and they couldn't, you know, go beyond that. But it was minimized, the idea that there should be no coercion, to a few insertions in this, which is the issue of apostasy, of course, changing your religion, which I don't think should be a crime at all. It's not in the Quran, and I have a longer discussion about that. But the other thing is religious policing, and checking if people are dressing in the right way, which, of course, is or, you know, if they're drinking wine, should they be flogged? 80 lashes or 40 lashes or maybe imprisonment. So there are those texts. And not, of course, all Muslim societies are today are living by these jurisprudential texts, but Saudi Arabia is. And And when there's a little bit reform, it is welcome. There's an amazing, liberation in Saudi Arabia, whereas you still go to the jail for even chopped up into pieces for criticizing the ruler. So it's not really a meaningful, I think, reform there. But in Iran, the compulsory hijab, there's a whole movement against that. In Afghanistan now, we will have the Taliban, of course, bringing laws on women or other anybody in society. And now, but also I emphasize one thing in the book. This is not the only form of coercion that Muslim women go through. There is coercion from the other opposite direction as well, which is most visible in France, right? If you're a Muslim woman today in France and you're a 16-year-old Muslim girl who's wearing a hijab, you can't go to a public high school. You'll be forced to take it off. In Turkey, we had a worse version of that. I was calling it the secularism police, like religion police, there was a secularism police forcing women to take it off. So, and that is also a violation of freedom, because my argument is that people have the right to be pious as they believe genuinely, and that can entail dress codes, they can very austere lifestyles, and that is what freedom means for them. But for others, it means the freedom to practice Islam in the way they believe it, or they can be heterodox, they can be not religious, they can maybe be ex-Muslims, and everybody should have the basic freedom to live according to the dictates of their conscience. And what do our Islamic texts say about this? How there are some seeds for this idea, but also some obstacles in medieval interpretation. So the book goes through these discussions with some catchy examples, if you will. And I think you already catch one of those, but we can continue. More.
Yeah, and so Dr. Nasser, I wanted to ask you, being from Iran, and so like I had mentioned, I grew up in Pakistan. Pakistan does not have a compulsory head covering law, but my sense is that it might be moving towards that. But for now, there are other laws in Pakistan that are problematic that we'll discuss. But at least when it comes to the wardrobe, there are no laws right now with Pakistan. But of course, in Iran, similar to Saudi Arabia, there are. So can you just talk a little bit about Iran and what that impact it's had?
The case of Iran reflects on several of the issues that Mustafa raised. One issue is actually the question of interpretation. In original religious texts, it says that men and women should dress modestly. Right? First of all, nobody polices men dressing modestly.
Exactly,
It's only women dressing modestly. But the term modest can be interpreted, just like the term corporeal punishments can be interpreted. I worked on Maulana Maududi, who was one of the original thinkers of Islam, what we call Islamic fundamentalism. And Maududi believed that until such time that you have a perfect Islamic society and there is no poverty or other kinds of reasons, and everybody's been educated in Islam, you actually cannot chop somebody's hand for theft. In other words, he had interpreted in a way to say, yes, we accept that this is in the punishments, but the conditions for its implementation are indefinitely suspended, which is a very different interpretation than when a general took over Pakistan and trying to be Islamic. The first thing he did, General Zia,
Islamization of laws.
So this is important. There is not a one interpretation. Unfortunately, we're in a period of history in the Muslim world where the more hardline, narrow interpretations have taken over. So, and I think that's very important. So even if we say there is no compulsion to religion, but there's compulsion in religion, but then still there is a gray area there. What are you compelling people to? Because that basically comes down to what sort of laws you're reading. Secondly, although it is often said that Islam is cultureless, but that's not true. Islam was born in the Arab culture, and there's a lot of Arab attitudes from the 7th century, but even today, that are being basically paraded as Islamic culture, right? So there is particularly, I think, since the finding of oil, because oil and the wealthiest part of the Muslim world became the one that, particularly on these sets of issues, had the
most rigid one,
most rigid one. That essentially, and then through the media, etc., has now been transported out. So Pakistan is a very good example. That people in Pakistan prayed, they were good Muslims for a very long time, but they didn't necessarily dress like people in the Arabian Peninsula do, men or women, and they didn't see that as an issue. Women had covered their hair, but not in the way that now they do now. So that there's a degree of Arabization of Islam, or let's say the Persian Gulf version of Arabization, because this is not even Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi practice over time. So we have to be mindful of that. And the irony of ironies to me is that actually the countries that are closest to the United States as allies are the ones that are being the exporters of the kind of Islam that actually is now being mostly criticized. Now, you would say Turkey or Iran, because of their historical legacies, are more immune to this, but Southeast Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, there's such an adoration of the Persian Gulf. And also they send workers there who then go back home thinking that it's actually a marker of wealth to dress like Saudis or to observe things. So that dynamic is there. The other issue is which falls into Iran. The sort of weaponization, I would call, of women's dress actually happened under Kemalism, right?
Both under the first Shah too. Actually.
No, that's what I meant. First in Turkey, and then in Iran. These were the sort of in the 1920s.
Right.
Were two experiments in the Muslim world, which basically said the path to progress is to completely disconnect from Islam, and you have to, by the state is in charge of forcibly changing the individual. So men have to wear different clothing, and
in Turkey there's a hat law.
And same in Iran. And in fact, they both believe that this was put there to prevent them from praying, because your head cannot hit the ground. And women were forcibly defrocked. I mean, in Iran, it actually became quite brutal. In 1935, the Shah sent the police to forcibly remove the veil. And there's there's stories of a generation of Iranian women who never left their house after that, because they felt, immodest and naked and all of that. Later on, it was relaxed a bit. But just like the Shah in Iran made change in women and men's dress the first marker of change, the very first thing that the Islamic Republic did was to remove that. And one of the very first people they executed in Iran after the revolution was a 90-some-year-old general who had been in charge of the troops that stormed the mosque in Mashhad, pursuing protesters against unveiling. And so if you look at it, Reza Shah was the name of the king, removed the veil, and Khomeini put it back on. With men's clothing, they couldn't do anything other than just make men's dress in Iran basically just a negation of Western dress, because that tradition had been lost. But this idea, and I think that we've, even though Kemalism has weakened in Turkey in recent years and in Iran it was toppled, how deep this idea of state engineering of the individual as a means to progress and change has sunk into the soil. So even, I would say, fundamentalists like Maududi and others, they took Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's, not his ideas, but his method, that the Islamic Republic in Iran is essentially a Kemalism in reverse. And just like,
Turkey is going towards that
direction too. But I think Mustafa is absolutely right. Coercion ultimately doesn't work, and this is a very big question for Islamic fundamentalism. And Iran is a perfect case, because Iran is the one place where an actual Islamic movement of that kind took over, other than Taliban, Afghanistan. And you're seeing that, particularly with generational change, that voluntary support for these edicts is loosening, and that if Islam is being force-fed to the population, then it's also responsible for all the shortcomings of the government, and therefore opposition to Islam means secularism. So in a way, the whole sort of circle has come to a full. And that's why also the women's issue is at the forefront of these issues, because this has now become the lynching. But I also want to say this, that the symbolism of women's headscarf now is a very modern thing. It was not this political, and it was not this steadfast, and is now penetrating in societies that historically didn't observe it in the same way.
Right.
And this is really more about, not about the religion, it's more about the dynamic of state-society relations that have been happening.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to hear the emphasis you made on illiberal secularism, as I can put it, that we've seen in Iran and Turkey for sure. And I just want to make sure that that's not what I'm arguing for. I mean, in the minds of some people, I mean, liberalism and secularism are almost interchangeable terms.
Right.
Well, these terms mean what we mean by them, but what I mean is a medium of freedom where people are practiced their religion in the way they deem fit and are not practice and not believe and the state is neutral towards the citizens. And that is secular, but it's a kind of secularity in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which really emphasizes the protection of natural rights and the limited government. Unfortunately, Muslim world has almost never experienced that. I mean, what we have experienced is French-style secularists, even more illiberal than France. I mean, Turkey went way beyond France in terms of bending that scarf. I mean, with all the respect to France, but their secularism is not always very liberal. And then you had the Islamists, and going back and forth. So I think the way forward is, which will bring peace to everybody, is a basic idea of freedom, and that's what this book is about.
And that's actually a great segue to a question that I have online. And for those of you who are watching, thank you, of course, for tuning in. But also, you can certainly ask your questions by using the hashtag Cato Events, and you can submit your question on our webpage, on Facebook, on Twitter, and it'll come up on my trusty iPad, and I'll be able to ask the question. So I have a question like that here for both of you. And since you both have discussed sort of, enforced piety and illiberal secularism, etc., like the role of the government, basically. So the question I have, it's from an anonymous person here that asks, must the government structure be agnostic for liberty to survive, or can there be a free theocracy? What do you think of that?
The term agnostic is, I think, for individuals, because I mean, the government doesn't have to refer to a religion and shouldn't, I think, refer to any religion. So it should be secular. But agnosticism is taking still a metaphysical stance on the big issue of whether there's a God or not. I mean, the government doesn't have to take any of this. The government exists to protect the rights of individuals, period, and the safety and of society and the orderly working. So a theocracy, by definition, is incompatible, I think, with freedom, because it will inevitably uphold one belief over another. But I should also say that the term theocracy isn't always exactly 100% relevant to Islam, because in classical Islam, you don't have theocracy implies that the ruler is somehow divinely guided, or in classical Islam, actually, the ruler wasn't considered like that. But the divine law, which is the Sharia, was considered as the foundation of the state. And actually, in my book, I show that this had a positive impact too, by the way. I mean, in classical Islam, you have many stories, which I relate in the book, that a ruler doing something unacceptable, tyrannical, and the scholars of the Sharia, Islamic law, say that, no, you cannot do this. This is against the Sharia. And since the law is above the ruler has to sometimes, the ruler stops, he's constrained by that structure. But ultimately, when you have a religious body of law like the Sharia, or it could be the Halakha, or it could be Hindu teachings. I mean, if you make that the supreme guide of the state, where we have a better model in the modern world, which is a neutral state that protects rights, that is a problem. But this doesn't mean that our religious traditions cannot be interpreted in a way to support the idea of a state based on contract. And in the book I go discuss, Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, contract with the tribes in Medina, where, I mean, he made a contract when he arrived in Medina with the Jewish tribes there. And the definition of the state, that's very nascent, small states there, isn't actually Islamic. I mean, this is a Medina state. People here are one ummah, one nation. To Muslims, their religion. To Jews, their religion. And this state is about protecting all of us. And if it's attacked, we will defend it together. So that's actually a neutral state, basically. So we see that in the very beginning of Islam, which for historical reasons I discuss actually didn't define the political trajectory, unfortunately, of the Muslim world. And Islamic supremacy, as I put it, became more definitive until the modern era. I hope this makes sense. I don't know.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what what the questioner is really asking is can there be a state that respects diversity of opinion and diversity of practice? And I think that's also a lot of it is the function of the state itself, as well as the function of the religious interpretation that is there. I mean, it's not just Kemalism that has been intolerant. Many states around the world, even to this day, don't tolerate a divergence of opinions, let's say on nationalism or on varieties of issues. So, so in some ways, you know, particularly Islamic activists, fundamentalists have internalized what is a sort of a modern world's ideas that are all exclusionary. So if you thought about modern nationalism, communism, fascism, all these isms are basically intolerant of alternate views. It's all about us and them. And
they're traitors, you know.
Absolutely. and I think, and again, this goes to this book. So, you know, when a lot of these debates about Islam in the modern world took place, let's say World War II era or earlier, the points of reference that Muslims were looking at in the West was not democracy. They were looking at these rigid states that were emerging in France and Germany, or Peter the Great in Russia, which is, you know, one way. So I think, you know, the importance of Mustafa's book is that it's time for the Muslims to have a different kind of reference point and to engage in debate with modernity of today, not the modernity of the 1930s. And modernity of today is really about political openness and economic openness. So I mean, the struggle of modern world is really between state and society everywhere, whether it's Myanmar or China or the West, or even in this country, we talk about you know, how much should the government regulate or not regulate, right? So I think that's the really appropriate way of thinking about it, and I think both his last book and this book provides a lot of tools for how the Muslims ought to think about not how they can create rigid systems that mimic you know, European systems of the 1930s, but how can they actually create plural systems that is more approximates the West that they live in. And I think particularly it's very important for Muslims living in the West, which is now quite sizable, about terms under which they integrate or live in societies that they are, because they confront that a very different modern world than the one that a lot of these rigid texts were about.
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point. And you mentioned that there are so many Muslims who are living in Western countries, and you definitely see that struggle too, especially when you have sort of in a larger space questions being asked about Sharia, right? It's like, oh, if you're a Muslim, do you believe in Sharia? And I've been asked that question, and I don't really know how to answer that. Yes and no, is that, I feel like that's a answer. And so my question, and this actually, I have a few questions on here about apostasy and blasphemy, so I'll just combine the questions for you. But my next question for both of you, and I'll start with Mustafa first, is you mentioned, rethinking Sharia. This is something that you talk about in this book, and also in a previous book of yours. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by rethinking Sharia? And in the book, you, Mustafa, had started actually the chapter on a really heartbreaking story from Pakistan about a woman who had been raped by her brother-in-law because her husband was in jail. And she went and finally reported it, and the police basically said that they basically said that she had no evidence that she had been raped, even though she did get pregnant and she had a child from that incident. And the police eventually, basically, she was jailed for that, and she was told that she needed 4 witnesses to show this crime. And she was eventually released from prison. And this was a story that I personally had followed very closely because I was living in Pakistan at the time. I was a teenager, and I just sort of had discussions even with my own father about this, like, how is this possible that this woman is saying that this has been done against her and she instead has been put in jail for this? And a lot of this discussion was about, rethinking Sharia and where do the laws of zina come from? Where do the laws of these, 4 witnesses come from? So I wanted to ask you basically what you meant by rethinking Sharia, and then also how that sort of applies to our modern world.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, first of all, when people ask, like, do you believe in Sharia? I say, yeah, I practice Sharia. I mean, I refrain from pork, I pray towards Mecca, and, to me, these are Sharia, right? Right. Because Sharia, just like the halakha in Judaism, defines partly your personal observance. And there's no problem with that. I mean,
I'm going to steal that answer.
So, there's no problem with that. I mean, But when you come to the issue of public law, penal code, you get into these texts of Islamic jurisprudence, which says, adultery should be stoned to death, which is not in the Quran, but comes from a hadith, that which is used to establish that, or some corporal punishments and regulations about women and so on and so forth. Now, and apostasy laws, blasphemy laws. So there are burning issues, there are problems, and we should be honest about that. Now, my fundamental argument is that these injunctions in classical Islamic law about women, about adultery, about morality and all that, they were legislations made in a certain historical context, which often made sense in its own context. But if you bring it today and make it the state law, you will end up in doing terrible things, which is what the Pakistan example that you mentioned is illustrating very, very dramatically. So that's why I began a chapter with that. The story is Zafran Bibi, a woman in rural Pakistan. She first got raped. When she went to court, she was given the death penalty for adultery. So why did this happen? I mean, she was ultimately saved, but why did this happen? Still, it was a tragedy. Because Pakistan Islamized its laws in the beginning in the 70s under General Zia-ul-Haq. And this was done in such a crude way that the consequences were not really thought. What they did was, in Islam, adultery is zina. It's known as zina. It's adultery and fornication, so both premarital and extramarital sex. And the punishment for that is, actually according to the Quran, lashes, but not stoning. But the key issue is that four witnesses are required for it. So if you're going to punish somebody for zina, you need 4 witnesses. Which, as I show in the book, the original intention was to protect women from accusations of adultery. Because Prophet Muhammad's own wife, Aisha, was accused unfairly for adultery. And the Quran said, no, you can't blame women, you have to bring 4 witnesses for this. So since it is such a shocking thing, you can't just throw that witness. And the protection of women is clearly the intention in the Quran. Now, what the Pakistani legislation did, they brought this adultery law. They didn't think of rape as a separate category. Rape was defined as adultery by coercion, zina bil jabr. So the laws that are applicable for adultery were also applicable for rape. Now, this turned everything upside down, because in the case of rape, you have a woman who says, I am raped. And they say to a woman, show 4 witnesses. Of course she can't. And the man gets away with it. Plus, if she gets pregnant, her pregnancy becomes an evidence that she committed adultery. So this was, and there were several cases in Pakistan, as I mentioned, and this is the perfect example of, or like a tragic example, of an injunction in the Sharia which had a sense and well-intentioned in its original context, beamed to 21st century, legislated in a country without understanding the intention and done in a crude way and leading to horrific human rights examples. So that's the beginning of the chapter, why we need to rethink the Sharia, and we should stop thinking of Sharia as a state law. It's practice, it's piety. A woman can wear hijab, that's Sharia for her, but it's not going to be implemented by the state. And since Muslims will never agree on what the exact Sharia is, because it depends on Hanafi being Shafi or Jafari or Ismaili or modernist, let the state be away, let the state protect human rights and natural rights. And Muslims follow Sharia in the way they understand it. I mean, you can even have Sharia courts, as they have in the UK, which is arbitration. It's not like a penal code. Just like halakha is in the modern world. I mean, today Orthodox Jews observe halakha in a modern society. It's their choice, and they don't eat. They eat kosher. It doesn't mean that the society shouldn't eat kosher. So they can practice in the way they want. I think that's the right approach to the Sharia. Of course, Sharia has a historical role in governance and all that. But in the other chapter about the book, about that in the book, I make the argument that was all about protecting justice and constraining rulers. So that should be the goal. And actually there I show a parallelism between the Sharia and liberalism, in the sense that both ideas are believed in the are based on the belief that the rulers, people with political power, should be constrained by a set of law that is above them.
Right.
And so that's a lesson from the historical experience of Sharia I extract.
Yeah. Dr. Nasir, what are your thoughts on
No,
reform?
I agree. The only thing I would add to Mustafa's points is that, and the last point to be said, that the guidance for many interpretations of the Sharia or law has been justice, and I think in the case in Pakistan case, clearly justice was not the mantra of the judges. It's a very narrow, literal reading of the text without any interpretation or having the notion of justice in mind. Secondly, I think the other point he made is very important, that Sharia is not actually implemented with the same vigor on all issues, right? So, in other words, there's specific issues that is implemented that even in the case of Pakistan, whether it was chopping of hands or it was adultery, was not implemented against the middle class or the elite, even though when it was brazen.
Yeah.
It was implemented selectively against the most helpless and the poor members of society, and that raises questions. And then again, on a lot of things, there is a lot of room for interpretation.
Right.
I mean, one way of thinking about the four witnesses is that, particularly in the context of when this was put down, is that it's an impossibility clause. Because it's almost impossible for you to find four witnesses, which means that you won't even prosecute the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? You would say there are no witnesses, nothing's happened. That's not good for the women, but in a sense that but this judge basically interpreted in a particular way. And there's room for interpretation, particularly in Shia Islam. There is even more room for
That's true.
interpretation,
Right.
And the individual ayatollahs can give a ruling. It's an issue that it's not unfamiliar here when it comes to constitutional interpretations. Here, is it literalist, or can you interpret? Some of the issues that we're fighting in this country over, much like the Sharia, were established at a different period in American history, like the right to bear arms.
Right.
Was consecrated in the Constitution when the government in the United States could not provide basic protection to people.
Right.
So you were deputized by the government to be essentially take care of yourself. But is that something that is unchanging, unchallengeable today? So I think that's exactly the point, that law has to evolve with times and has to make sense and has to be about justice.
Right. And so my one last question that I have, and I wanted to make sure that we touched on the concept of economic liberty as you discuss in your chapter as well. So you start the chapter by telling the story of a gate in Istanbul's famous Grand Bazaar, which is fantastic. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Great. You visited Istanbul.
I did visit Istanbul. Yes, I did.
I mean, millions of people visit Istanbul, and many of them probably go to Grand Bazaar.
Yes.
In one of the gates of Grand Bazaar, there is a Arabic beautiful, green on gold engraving, and it writes "Al-Kasib Habibullah," which means those who earn money are the friends of God, or God loves those who earn.
Right.
And what is this? Well, this is saying a hadith, coming from Prophet Muhammad. But why did Prophet Muhammad say this? Oh, he himself was a merchant, and he has other hadith saying, praising actually the honest merchant. And there's also a saying that he established Medina, and he said the first thing he did was to establish a market, and said there will be no taxation in this market.
Right.
And then people came to him at some point and asked, like, the prices are too high, can you fix the prices? And he said, no, only God fixes the prices. So there's this very interesting business-friendly, if you will, approach in early Islam, particularly coming from Prophet Muhammad's profession before he was also the early Muslims too. I mean, Quraysh, his tribe was a trading tribe. And that allowed the rise of a pre-modern Islamic capitalism, which was very successful for its day and age. And Muslims invented some finance techniques which made its way to Europe. For example, the word check comes from the Arabic word sak, which is a written document. So in that chapter, I give these kind of some highlights to argue that the idea of a free market economics isn't alien to Islam. Ibn Khaldun made a theory of it, and that's why he was the pioneer of the Laffer curve, or Ronald Reagan referred to Ibn Khaldun in his speeches for some, issues of taxation and so on and so forth. What happened in the modern era is some problems in Islam they're traditional problems, and so there are some modern solutions. But there are some traditional blessings and some bad modern solutions. What happened in the 20th century is that we had a previously unheard of idea called Arab socialism, right? This engagement with a more leviathan, like a big state that will organize everything and dominate the economy, take over foundations, which were private before. So that was a wrong model. And some of the problems in the Muslim world have traditional roots. Others come from bad modernization. And I criticize this state-centric economic approach that came either in the form of statism in Turkey. In Turkey it was called statism, and in Arab world it was called socialism. And I know Vali has books and very important perspectives on that. The way forward will be economic liberty as well as personal liberty and freedom of speech and political freedom in the Muslim world.
Yeah. And Vali, what are your thoughts on sort of economic liberty?
Just to add to what Mustafa said, often dealing with the developing world, when you can't explain why societies cannot progress or are regressing, religion becomes sort of a easy way of explaining it. I remember a time when the argument was that Asian countries cannot develop because of their Confucian mindset. And then we reached a point where actually the Confucian mindset became the reason for their growth. Now there are problems.
Weber said that actually.
That's right. That's right. Weber said that.
Weber was great on many things, but he got something wrong.
But then we say that they're actually Koreans, Japanese, Chinese. That work ethic is actually beneficial. So I think we have the same thing about Islam in the sense that there are many other reasons why Muslim societies have not done well economically, and that the Middle East, for instance, is lagging behind other regions of the world, and it's not necessarily can be easily explained based on the faith. And there are certain issues that in the modern period have become a problem, like the Muslims not wanting to pay interest, and although I think that's open to interpretation what it is, but the irony of ironies, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, they actually decided that they cannot run an economy without some way of putting a price on money. And the economy is too big to have one interest-free bank and make it work. So in a basic way, Iran does pay interest in its banks, and it functions very much like the other economies. Now they found a way, and this Shiites might have it easier than Sunnis, to interpret this and move forward, which tells you that when push comes to shove, the law can change, and it's not immutable. Some things in Iran have not changed, but and in fact, I may have gone backwards looking to the past. But some things, have evolved as a result of exigency. But again, there is ample room to think that if there is freedom in choosing your faith, in how you practice your faith, if there is pluralism of ideas, that then it also applies to pluralism of economic activity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's a good point. And so I wanted to also ask you, and we have several questions here about this concept, but I'll just sort of combine them all into one. And to me also, one of the most intriguing chapters was, is liberty a Western conspiracy, right? Is the concept of liberty something that just came from the West, and that's something that's so foreign to Muslim countries or to the Islamic world? And we have a few questions here basically asking why is it that in Muslim countries, or why is it that European countries do not accept more liberal movements? One commenter has asked why the Muslim Brotherhood was not accepted in Egypt. And so if both of you can talk a little bit about that, why is it now in today's sort of world, when we think of liberty, the first thing we think of is that it's a Western concept? And where did it start in Islam?
Well, this is a double-edged sword, and as I explained in my book, yes, in the modern world today, Muslim world, if you go speak about civil liberties, freedom of speech and religion, liberalism, oh, that's a Western thing, and there must be a Western agenda behind that, like a colonial agenda. And I say in the book, well, Muslims are partly justified to think like that, because Napoleon invaded France in the middle of the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, and he said, I brought you freedom. And then France colonized Algeria, and they said, we brought freedom to your women. And actually one wise man in Algeria asked, then why did you bring so much gunpowder, right? So colonial powers used the idea of bringing freedom, and the last dramatic example of that was the Iraqi occupation. I mean, it was called Iraqi Operation Freedom, right, in 2003, and it remains in the minds of a lot of Muslims with the tortures in Abu Ghraib and a lot of terrible things. So this doesn't mean that freedom is a lie. This just means that it's a value that can be instrumentalized sometimes by some powers for their own interest. We should oppose that instrumentalization, but we should not oppose the value of freedom. And that is precisely what the Islamic liberals did. As I have long quotes in the final chapter from Namık Kemal, who was he was called the New Ottomans. I mean, these were Islamic intellectuals. They were pious Muslims, but who admired Western constitutionalism and tried to reconcile. Hayreddin al-Tunusi from Tunisia, he was the first actually full-fledged political liberal in the sense that he argued for freedom of government, freedom of speech, a free economy, and then he went back to the Sharia and tried to reconcile them. So Muslims need freedom not because there's a colonial agenda, but for our own selves, that we don't oppress each other. We have thriving societies. And West can be an exemplar model when it is worked in that sense. But when it comes with drone strikes and wars and that sort of thing, it's a problem. And that's why if Muslim world will go forward, it will happen thanks to not more wars and conquests and more, violent conflicts between East and West, but with more integration, with more. That's why I have a slogan: make capitalism not war. Right? Make business with Muslim societies and not any more endless wars.
Right.
No, I agree. I think Mustafa put it very well.
Yeah. And so I have one question here, from our audience members. And again, for those of you who are watching online, thank you. You can use the hashtag Cato Events and also submit a question on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as you watch along. So the question here is more about sort of the history of Islam and whether or not Islam was more accepting of liberty during Islam's golden age. So my question to you is, what do you think the Islamic golden age is? And what does that mean for
Well, the Islamic
world?
Golden Age generally refers to from the 8th to the 12th century, especially Baghdad, but also Cordoba and the great Islamic civilization, centers where Muslims engage with philosophy. It was a universalistic civilization, trade, capitalism, and more freedom of thought as well. I mean, I have a chapter on free speech, and I remind that the Abbasid Caliphate had an institution called munazara, like for salon of debate, Mejlis al-Munazara, where they were bringing Muslims and Christian theologians and saying, discuss, and the Christian theologians, you're free to say whatever you want. That it was not as liberal as today, but for its time, it was actually the most liberal civilization. And it's not me who says that. Bernard Lewis says that the classical Islamic civilization gave more freedom to the people compared to the contemporaries. That's why Jews repeatedly fled Christendom to the classical Islamic civilization, which had more freedom for the Jewish people to compared to the Inquisition and all that opposition. What happened is, unfortunately, that classical Islamic civilization stagnated and didn't move much in the past few centuries, where in the West liberty flourished. And when Muslims saw the onslaught of modernity, they even became more reactionary, some of them. And we had these radical movements which shapes Iran, which shapes the Taliban and other troubling movements in the world today.
Right. You have thoughts?
I think I agree that the golden age is not very early Islamic history, but the golden age is let's say the Islamic empire in Spain, the empire in Baghdad, even in Istanbul under the Ottomans, or the Safavids, in height of the Safavids, or the Mughals in India. And in each of these you see high culture tremendous production of the very best sort of literature, arts, music in the Muslim world. And I think it's marked by a few things which are important to note. One is it's an era of confidence. So there is this is so you know these rulers at the height of their power at that moment were confident in their own shoes, and that and so they were not either threatened by the West, or they were not in a defensive mode. The problem that today's Muslim world is, per Mustafa's last answer, is that we're in a defensive mode. Right. We're sort of circling the wagons against Western attack, and the more attack comes, like post 9/11, after Muslims, the more we circle the wagons. Whereas in those periods there wasn't that. Secondly,
there was no conspiracy theory
there were no
back then.
conspiracy theories, and then these people were rulers of the world in the way they saw it. Secondly, there was a period of willingness to engage culture and be open to culture. So. You had these great emperors in India who like Emperor Akbar, or who had a Hindu wife, a Muslim wife, a Christian wife, and they actually sought ways in which to coexist and merge and marry Islam to Hinduism, or in the case of the Ottomans with their Christian subjects, or and so that created a kind of cultural effervescence. Which demanded a more open interpretation of the Sharia than the rigidity of, no, we cannot do this and we cannot do that. So it was a period that the boundaries of Islam was opening towards new ideas, new modes of arts and music and culture. And I think that's what's lost. In other words, that confidence doesn't exist, and therefore that openness doesn't exist,
and that freedom
doesn't exist.
Well, thank you both for today, and thank you all for tuning in and listening in to this great discussion. For those of you who have not, I would urge you to read this book, whether or not you're Muslim. I think this is an excellent book to read, especially if you want to know more about where Islam lies in terms of liberty. And if you're a libertarian, I think this is definitely a worth reading. So thank you so much.
They can buy the book, but also libertarianism work freely allows a download.
Yes. You can download it, a free PDF for those of you who are environmentally friendly. So thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you again, Mustafa and Dr. Nasser, for your time.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.